Welcome back to another episode of Content That Grows. And today I am excited to be sitting back down with my co-founder, Kevin King. How's it going, Kevin?
Pretty good, Nate. How about yourself?
Doing well. Excited today. You know, we've been cruising along through this number of podcasts this season to really cover a lot of topics. And, you know, so we've kind of gone through understanding your ICP and their pain points, identifying topics and search intent, building a strategy and a roadmap with topic clusters, how to create quality content, even how to some of the CTAs, conversion aspects of that. And now we want to get into publishing cadence and updating existing content. So if you didn't listen to any of the prior ones or you want some context on one of those, definitely check out the previous episodes in season 2 where we went into depth on all of those. But for today, you know, we're going to cover in this episode why these things are important, some of the key elements of each, and then just also how you can incorporate it into your content strategy. So jumping right in, you know, Kevin, I think it'd be super interesting just to get going with sharing what are some of the reasons why it's important to have a consistent publishing cadence.
Yeah, I mean, for us historically being really heavily rooted in organic search, I think the biggest one that stands out is really organic SEO health. A frequency of publishing or consistent publishing there just ensures that you're going to make sure you're enhancing the website, expanding the website, getting more URLs indexed, which really in turn drives the number of keywords that you're ranking for up. Right, which is good because that means you're getting the ability, your potential for being discovered for brand queries, of course, which would grow over time, but most importantly, non-brand queries, things that would possibly fall throughout the funnel or the buyer journey, right? Really, really important for that just generally. Like if a website stops growing, then Google kind of just disregards it. So organic health in that regard is really important. And then the other side of that is the more content that you can publish and internally link. We talk a lot about content clusters, topic clusters, content hubs, however you define it internally. The more content you publish, the more opportunities you have to connect that to pages and other pages on the website in a meaningful way, right? So that also helps lift organic search visibility and traffic over time. So I'd say those are some of the key things around organic health. And then return visitors. And this is a kind of a broader spectrum of how it works, but if you are consistently publishing really quality content, which we know is a bit subjective, it should bring users back. If you get on people's radar, they'll notice that you are producing content in a frequent clip. They'll want to come back, check out the latest thing you publish, right? That's obviously something that's a bit harder to attribute, but we've seen over many years of blog publishing that's usually consistently the case. And then what in turn happens usually is an increased social share and reach across social, right? You publish content consistently, it's got high quality, people are going to want to share it, get more reshares, all that, which then in turn just drives new users and visibility. But again, frequency of publishing is really critical. If you stop publishing, people will forget you. The internet moves fast these days. And then cross-functional use cases is big. So internally, love talking about content that sits in the middle of the Venn diagram across core teams like marketing, sales, and CS. So from the CS side, you produce really good content that kind of hits on all of those things. It could provide value to current customers. And it's really, really great to enable a customer success or support team to be able to be oh, have you checked out this latest piece that we published on our blog that ties back to maybe a problem that your customers are having? And then similarly, sales enablement, sales aspect of that. Salespeople love to use content, and marketing likes to enable sales to use content to communicate to prospects around what's again a problem that they might need to be solved, and you establishing your authority around that. It's just really great, and the frequency aspect of that is that the more recently you've published, the more effective it likely is. If it's a few years old or anything like that, it's going to be stale. So you want to make sure that you keep doing that.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think it's, we talk a bit about a lot of times, good content and content that's being published at a consistent rate can tend to be like kind of fuel for a lot of marketing. So you kind of have, like we said, the return, the social sharing. It just also continues to be what you're sharing in newsletters and breaking up and sharing more social posts around it, and maybe creating videos and sharing with sales. And so, totally makes sense that it's definitely, I think a lot of folks from an SEO perspective think about it that way, and understanding kind of the indexation perspective, but it really does go far beyond SEO and has a lot of the benefits there for all of marketing and sales.
For sure. And I'm loving the organic aspect of content, and what it can do from an SEO perspective is always going to be near and dear to my heart, our team's heart, and all that, I think. But it's always just a starting point that I think can just benefit so many other aspects of a business if you're keeping that in mind as a starting point, but ultimately making sure that you reuse it in all these different ways is super powerful.
Yep, totally.
So with that, in terms of like process, what do you think are some of the key factors that are necessary to be able to publish consistently?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot, there's a big difference when you kind of go from, we're, publishing 1 or 2 posts a month and sort of normal in an earlier stage company, kind of doing whatever you can. But as a program matures and you really kind of get into like, there's just a lot more going on and wanting to publish more and more consistently. There's also just a lot of things that can kind of work against you in that if it's not planned properly. So I think number one is just having a clear strategy. You really kind of knowing what's the big picture instead of just constantly trying to pick topics or decide, who publishes when or whatever. Like a clear strategy, and then with that, really kind of tying into like quarterly and monthly planning. So I think that's like a big factor in that too, is not just like the high level strategy, but like every quarter, every month, specifically what needs to happen. And ideally you're planning that ahead of the month starting. Another big factor in that quarterly and monthly planning is you have to have margin in those plans. If you want to be publishing consistently, you cannot be, packed full schedule, and then when things pop up, it totally derails your systems and kind of throws off the consistency. So you have to build in margin with that. I think another big factor is having a rolling backlog. So really, getting ahead in your publishing, in the creation of content is super important. So you shouldn't be publishing something the day that it's finished. You should be working ahead and have, ideally at least a week, maybe as much as 4 or 5 weeks. This creates a very healthy balance for your team and allows them to do whatever they need to do and take time off or whatever to keep things going. That's a huge part of it, is really just having that buffer. And then similarly, is a buffer helps here, but you really need to have good processes. Like no one's really publishing just straight text in any content type, and so there's always kind of a need for like design, and you also have like editing needs. And so if that's not all neatly contained in a team that you're running, then you're dependent on other people with other priorities. So you need to have a good process to have a very clear understanding of how you keep getting those elements, so that you don't feel like, we have all the content, but we're waiting on design for all these things, and really just building that process to be proactive. And then lastly, I would say is just bandwidth, being realistic about what you have. Either that's all internal, or you have an agency or a contractor, or some combination of both. But really making sure you kind of have the right bandwidth to create whatever you're setting out in the strategy and the planning, so that it's, again, just sort of realistic and you're able to do what you set out to do.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. I mean, process and resources key to making sure that you can actually publish consistently, which is something I think a lot of companies struggle with, especially early on. Just how do you define process, or what do you need to define process, and all that. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that there isn't one size fits all process for these types of things, right? But as long as you do build out a process, even if it's not imperfect, especially early on, that's what's going to actually enable you to publish consistently and do all these things that you outline: clear strategy, monthly planning, right? Like all of that is wrapped around just establishing a process. So it's super, super key.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, it's probably a couple plugs for season 1 episodes in there as well. I think Chelsea and I, Chelsea from Chili Piper, we talked a bit about that, having that margin and being able to like kind of adapt to real-time opportunities and stuff within the company. So there's some good content there to kind of dive in more. And then John Bonini of DataBox, he and I definitely covered quite a bit on like the process side of things. And one of the things I remember from kind of building on what you just said, is like a lot of process improvements come out of just continually solving your own pain. And so I think that's a super interesting way to kind of keep thinking about that as you're building it, is like, don't necessarily get frustrated. I mean, you can, but like, don't get frustrated because things are not working. Like, just peel back the layers, figure out why, and then build a process to fix it, and then tweak that process over time. So, but yeah, so I think it's a super helpful list of things that kind of like really kind of help you build into the consistency and not get thrown off track. But one thing that I think we should also touch on is sometimes we hear people being a bit hesitant about like publishing consistently, and it feels a little too like formulaic to them. And so I think it would be interesting to kind of hear you highlight some of the areas where you think that's people are just kind of like shy away from publishing consistently.
Yeah. I think actually on that point, one of the big things I think that has become more popular over the years is ultimately this idea of just, which isn't surprising, but quality over quantity, right? Focusing in on, let's spend time thoughtfully on a really good piece of content. It doesn't matter how frequently we publish, like let's just say we're going to do one a month, but ultimately that goes back to still establishing some sort of process and cadence, right, which is consistent. But I think that's a big thing that companies are getting a little bit stuck on, and not really focusing on finding out a good balance between, like, yes, there is a way to get quality, and it doesn't have to be just one piece that's long or whatever, but you can have a balance, because there's opportunity cost at not probably pushing the pedal a little bit on getting content out a bit more frequently, because I think you strike that balance. But I think another one is, which is tied to that as well, though, is ultimately being resource strapped and unsure on how to actually scale a consistent production and publishing process, which, I mean, your last couple points were really tied to that. And another big one, too, though, which I think we see even more often, is just attribution of content performance. I think that kind of it holds people back a bit. Of course, you need to focus on ROI to some extent, and how content is impacting your business. But I think that so very often we encounter businesses or teams that are like, maybe not focusing in on like engagement across a lot of different factors, like social, or a lot of different things that aren't just pure, straightforward ROI attribution. So I think like ultimately they get mixed up in, should we even continue to publish content consistently? Like, let's push out something every once in a while. Sure. We know we should, but we don't know what it's doing for us. So let's just focus there, even though they might have the signals telling them this is doing something for you, but not directly towards an ROI or conversion or anything like that. And then I would say also just like not wanting to oversaturate an audience, right? And you if you publish a lot and you are in a specific space where maybe you could potentially exhaust some topics, or feel that you don't want to hit your audience over the head with a lot of the same kind of content, even though there's a lot of things you can get out of it. So I think that can be something. On the flip side of that, there's sometimes not a really great process for identifying topics to publish, right? I think that it can get pretty difficult to understand what to prioritize and where to start and all that. So like I just think thematically across a lot of these, it's just a lot of kind of like we don't know where to start, so let's just be really conservative about how we do go about publishing, right? So yeah, I'd say those are some of the biggest things that really kind of like hold people or teams back from publishing pretty consistently.
Yeah, I would say I hear a lot the oversaturating, which is funny, because it's like you probably could squash that line of thinking pretty quickly if you would just think about what's your TAM and then like how many impressions and views and how much engagement are you getting on the content, like in kind of just getting yourself out of that mindset to not think that it's always the same people seeing the same stuff. But it's still fair. You don't want to have balance in that. And I think the other one is definitely the quality over quantity. I think anytime you start talking about specific amounts per month or anything like that, it really, for some people, just really starts to feel like, well, it can't be quality if it's, we're hitting a certain amount. And I think that the items that I talked about earlier really are big factors in making sure that you are keeping up quality, but you're also just adding framework and clear expectations and marching towards something that's consistent and not just low quality.
For sure. Which one of the things about the topic selection kind of area, not understanding where to focus or even oversaturating, right? Oversaturating content or your audience on a specific topic over and over again around creating new content, especially. We talk a lot about updating existing content as a core function to a production team or a content team. What are some of the reasons why you think companies really can and should update existing content?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's big. I think certainly in the last couple of years, more people have become aware of it. Even just when I jump on calls with folks, I feel like there's a decent amount of people that'll be like, here's what we're doing, and we're updating content, and we're refreshing, and they're very eager to kind of call out that they're doing that. So I think it's something that's become more familiar to teams, but in terms of like why someone should or can be doing that, I think one of the biggest is content decay. We've talked about that quite a bit. You have a pretty in-depth guide on that on our blog as well. And there's a couple of factors. One is like you really have to stay on top of it. The more and more content you have, like it's just natural that you're going to have some declines in performance, and that happens from competition or internal competition. There's a number of reasons in why that can happen, but really just trying to be looking at the data on a frequent enough cadence that you can see if something is stalled out or actually declining, that you can dig in, understand why, and make the changes to prevent that from going down before you discover that it's dropped 70%, over the last few months or whatever. And so, a big reason for that is like if you think about all the work you're putting into new content that you want to start generating traffic and bringing people in and awareness, engagement, and all that, the more you have to work that much harder to offset the things that are declining sort of under the surface. And so really the way that you get that like compounding growth and like a much faster growth rate is that you're keeping that in check so that it's not working against you and eroding. I think another reason, especially for anyone kind of coming into a new program with a lot of existing content, most often updating an existing post will tend to produce better results faster than trying to create something new. And so that can be a good way to kind of get some early wins, some tailwinds to be able to then kind of balance out. And I know for some clients, we've focused entirely on updating existing content before we even create anything new. And so I think that's a big one, is just faster gains. And then lastly, you think about how much time and energy and care you're putting into creating a new piece right now, this month. You should take some steps to like maintain that and still care about it in 6 months or 12 months enough to to go back and make sure it's still up to date. It still has, good references and screenshots and all that stuff. So it's also just like kind of being a good steward of all the things that you're spending time on now, and not just sort of like getting on that treadmill and create it and then forget it ever existed, never look at it again.
For sure. Yeah, that last point is, I think, super important to really hammer home, which is just if you're creating content that ultimately you wouldn't want to update at some point or nurture to continue to grow, then like that shouldn't exist. And that's a whole other aspect of content updating, right? Which we've touched on before. And but yeah, you just got to nurture it. Like anything that's organic, which this is, like requires that level of nurturing and care. And we've talked about it, I think, in that content decay guide on our blog, the content lifecycle, right? Like there's a specific few phases or stages of the life cycle that like it initially grows and plateaus and it can decay, right? Like once you start to understand that that's how a piece of content like lives and breathes, quote unquote, over time, you'll start to like really care that like, oh, I want to bring this back to life. So it's super important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what you mentioned is a great point, that like if it's not even worth taking care of long term, then like why create it in the first place? I think that's a really healthy way to think about it. And yeah, I mean, I think overall there's just so much to it, and I know there were some pieces that I've encountered over the years where like it's also just a function of competitiveness in that particular SERP for that topic or whatever, where some things potentially need to be refreshed, updated, recalibrated, whatever, as much as like every other month or quarterly, and that's just because you have some very, very skilled people on the other side that are really just sort of doing the same thing, and you're sort of duking it out for the SERPs. So that's I think an important aspect as well, is like kind of understanding that some you really have to stay on top of, especially if they're high traffic drivers, or you're if you're at 30,000-40,000 a month and you're losing 50% on that in a quarter, that's a huge swing. You're talking about 20,000 visits gone per month, in how many new pieces of content you have to create to make that up. So it's a really big factor and an important aspect. And I would say the question that we get the most is folks just trying to understand what is that balance of new versus existing. And the short answer is it's different for everybody. But really like understanding how to incorporate the updates into like the regular publishing cadence.
Yeah, I mean, I think it all comes back down to process, right? A couple of factors really outside of that, but it starts with process. I think you can't update existing content if you don't have any, right? So like, I think ultimately you need to have like at least 1 to 2 years worth of content, just so you can observe that natural content life cycle that we kind of touched on. Because there's going to be a specific point within every stage of with every point in that content lifecycle where you can pinpoint where you should start to update it, right? Like if there's this natural trajectory that it goes on, once it starts to decay, you want to update it, right? Maybe if it's plateaued, you want to get ahead of that decay. Or even at the beginning, you've just noticed it's been time and it's not performing in that level that you would project it out or predict it to be performing. So like ultimately you need time. So that is a key thing, right? I think that goes without saying, just so you can observe those natural growth patterns. And then you can build that process probably around it, which ultimately comes back to like a monthly or quarterly analysis, right? You don't want to get in over engineer or do it for too long or too frequent, right? So monthly to quarterly is probably pretty good depending on how much content you're publishing. Quarterly is probably is good enough because then you could build a roadmap of it, right? Depending on how much content you have. But like at a high level, you got to establish some sort of cadence to make sure that your either content team, or maybe you have an SEO team or an SEO person, or if you're a marketer of one, that you're just like, let's check in on across like Google Search Console and see where impressions, clicks, and rankings are across key pieces of content, and just go like, nope, time for an update. And over time, you will start to see that. There is probably, like, depending on the competitiveness or amount of traffic that you get, that you're going to be like, oh, let's just earmark this for, we'll update this once a year or once every other quarter, just check in on it. And you can build a really good repository or future roadmap for how you do that. And then ultimately that'll establish kind of like the ratio at which you should be building out, or the ratio of new versus like updating content, right? Because it's not going to be the same for every business. You might be like, I want to update one and publish 3 pieces, right? If you're on a once a week cadence, essentially, you're publishing 4 to 6 pieces a month, right? And then you can, adjust that, just again, depending on how much decay or performance degradation or whatever you want to call it across the content you have is happening. And then I think you'll really be into a good rhythm around like actually getting that into the production process, and then that'll just scale, right? You tweak it as you go and you publish more content and kind of rinse and repeat.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think there's a lot there that you mentioned. I think certainly having the bank of content is really important. But even just, kind of having that, like, whatever, just set a recurring calendar for yourself or whatever, a recurring task in your task management system that pops up every 3 months and says, hey, go check this. And if you're a team of 1, the very least, jump into Search Console, compare last 3 months to the 3 months before that, and just descend and just see what's falling apart, and start there. I mean, you don't have to have a big team to be able to keep an eye on it and make sure you're incorporating everything you're doing there. And then I think the other thing to mention is that it is a helpful thing once you do start looking at it regularly to understand resourcing. I think is a really big part too. So if you say, well, we have enough resources to create 8 posts a month, and you are in a very competitive space, you have a lot of existing content, and you realize that you have to update at least 8 per month just to not lose traffic, then that is a resourcing question to say, do we want this channel to just maintain, or do we need more resources to maintain and grow on top of that? So I think that's a great resourcing perspective as well.
Yeah, totally. I think like you'll get to a level, I think that's a really good point, another one to like really emphasize around, that there is a bit of like making sure that you aren't losing any gains. So figuring out a formula to understand how to like prevent that, traffic or lead loss, whatever it is that you're seeing, by making sure you're like, oh no, we have to update X number of pieces along with publishing new. So super, super important to think through. With that, understanding exactly the balance of, what should be and shouldn't be updated, or how frequent you should be. What are some of the ways that existing content can like tactically, strategically be updated?
Yeah, I think that's it's certainly a big one. We probably could have done a whole podcast episode just on that at a very deep level, but I think it is important to at least go a level or two deeper into this, because a lot of people just say refreshing content or updating content, but that there are different ways you go about it. So I think one is consolidating content. So sometimes, like you said before, when you start to get this library of content, then you can kind of look at what's going on. You can see, well, we actually have like 4 or 5 different posts that are actually kind of like not that complete, and they're all sort of around this like larger topic. And so we can actually just take all of that, combine those, set up 301 redirects from the other posts into the new one, and really kind of make this a clear, solid resource for someone to kind of be able to see end to end. So consolidation is a big one. Not quite a flip side, but like a little bit of an alternative to that is sometimes you see in the content that as you look at the data, that there are queries that are matching to posts, and they're not ranking well, but it's a signal that sort of the search engine is saying, hey, we see this as related to what you created here, but you just know you're not going enough in depth on that. So you may actually just want to add a whole H2 and a whole section to go more in depth on that, or you break it out into its own post and have like internal links. So that's another area where you can say we're seeing some signals, but we have to do something different to really be able to kind of optimize for that. And then I would say, another thing is sort of like balancing. Sometimes you just need a full refresh. It's like, hey, this is 3 years old. It's not quite right. The intent's changed a little bit. Like there's just a bunch of stuff. We basically just need to start from scratch or, rewrite 80-90% of this. And I would consider that kind of a full refresh, full rewrite. But other times, it's a lighter one and it's, maybe tweaking a headline or some H2s or, adding a little bit of context here. Again, some of the data you're seeing, but it's just some tweaks to kind of just like help bump it back up in performing well there. And then lastly, I think there's just sort of like some maintenance and like just make like what we talked about before, like just making sure your content is well maintained. So a big one is like when product design changes for your company and or you add new product features or whatever, then like kind of going back and understanding where there's product screenshots within your content to update that. Sometimes sources that you cited, the website's shut down or it's no longer as trusted or whatever it might be. Things like that you want to kind of update links, external links that you have in your content. And then I think just also, I think I talked about this before, like if your target audience has changed, you went from kind of being everything to everyone and you just focus on enterprise or you're just narrowing in on a certain ICP. Looking back through your content in that standpoint, you may need to make some refreshes and really just be able to speak to your audience well. So I would say that like there's a lot of ways that you can do it, and there are each post requires like looking at it, understanding what should you do with this, what is needed, and what's the best way to kind of like get the most out of updating it.
Yeah, all of those are super effective. And I think what's important for marketing teams or businesses to understand that, because we've talked a lot about process, is that understanding those different tactics can inform process, which will allow teams to understand the scope of work and project manage around content production a lot more effectively, right? Because if you're doing a full refresh, that's a full piece of content that we need to go re-research or whatever. If you're doing a light refresh, like that won't take as long. Like it'll allow you to understand what you can maybe get out even quicker versus what will take more time. So I think it's really important for people to understand that like you can build a process around understanding the types of content to create and the types of content that you are updating and the ways you're updating them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely have been part of that in that we had a pretty clear understanding of, 2 light refreshes basically equaled 1 full refresh. And so when you're doing that monthly planning and you have a really good understanding of, okay, we can do 2 full refreshes, 2 light refreshes, and this many new posts, and here's the ones that are, most in need or whatever, like it's extremely helpful. So totally agree. Build a lot of process around that. So yeah, I think this has been great. We kind of went through, the how and why on consistent publishing, and then also kind of digging in a bit on existing content and why it makes sense to be looking at that, updating that. So lots of great stuff there. Next episode, we'll be jumping into a little bit more on like content distribution and repurposing. So excited to get into that. But with that, we'll wrap it up. Please subscribe the podcast in Apple, Spotify, anywhere you're listening. We would appreciate that. Please check out 10speed.io/podcast for all the previous episodes this season that I mentioned, with some of the stuff we've already gone through, as well as season 1 where we had quite a few different guest interviews. So check those out as well. And with that, we'll wrap it up. Thanks, Kevin.
Yep. Thanks, Nate.